peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is part 3 of the McCalls 7892 sew along. So today we are going to be making the sleeves and making the top and putting all of our elements together to finish our dress. So let's get started. Jumping around all over the place again as usual, so I'm going to try something a little bit different with my facings this time. Somebody recommended this to me when I was making the sweetheart dress, so I'm going to sew my facings together without them being interfaced. Then I'm going to interface them in a particular way, which I will of course show you. So I'm going to sew my back neck facing to my front facings at the shoulder seams, matching up the notches. You want to make sure that this little notch here, or this seam allowance line here, is towards the center. So if these the right way up and this one the wrong way up, and I'm going to stitch them at 5/8 of an inch at the shoulder seams. I've sewn my facing pieces together and I have pressed them, the shoulder seams open. I've also sewn my interfacing together at the shoulder seams. Do not try and press this open, you will end up with a sticky mess stuck to your iron. So we're going to finger press these open. I've sewn this together with the right sides together, and the right side of the interfacing is the non-sticky side, so the non-rough side. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to attach these right sides together, and we're going to sew around the outer edge, which is going to be our finished edge on the inside of our garment, and I will show you what that looks like when we get there. I have my interfacing pinned to my facing fabric, right sides together, so this is the glue side here and this is the wrong side of the fabric, and I've got it pinned around the outer edge. Now this is the edge that the pattern would like us to turn in 1/4 of an inch along long unnotched edge, press, easing in fullness, stitch close to the edge. So we're going to sew all the way around this edge at 1/4 of an inch. You should end up with something that looks like this. So the next thing that we need to do is turn it so that the wrong side's together, and then we are going to fuse the interfacing to our facing piece. Wish me luck. I really like how this has turned out. It was a little bit fiddly having to roll the interfacing to the so that the wrong sides were together to then iron it down, but not prohibitively so. It just took a little bit extra time, but I really like that clean finish on this edge. I was going to top stitch it down, but I don't even need to do that. I think it looks really nice, and this is a nice finish for lighter weight fabrics like rayons and silks and things like that, because adding bias binding to this would add bulk, which you don't want to do. So yeah, very pleased with that. Really like that finish. Okay, so now we can go to step 2 which is to gather the upper and lower edge of bodice front between small circles as shown, and we're going to do the same for the lower edge of the back bodice. But before I can do that, I need to sew my back bodice together because I cut mine with a seam because I didn't have enough fabric to cut it on the fold. Before we take our pattern piece off of our fabric, we want to make sure that we've marked in our notches, and I do that by snipping into mine, and then we also want to mark in our gathering points. So I put a pin through the position that I need to mark, and then I fold back the paper and the fabric, and I use my friction pen to make a little mark. So I've got a little blue mark there. I'm actually going to get my chalk marker and make a white mark on this black piece of fabric so that I can see it. I have made a blue mark, but it's not the easiest thing to see. So I'm going to go around and I'm going to do that for the 2 shoulder pieces, the gather points at the back, and I'm going to do the same for the front. We need to gather at the shoulder and at the bottom edge, so I'm going to put the gather points in for those as well. As I mentioned, I need to sew my back seam up because I have added a seam allowance there because I couldn't cut mine on the fold. I'm going to sew it with a French seam, so I have the wrong sides pinned together, and I'm going to sew that at 1/4 of an inch. I've sewn my first line of stitching at 1/4 of an inch. I'm now trimming my seam allowance down in half, so it is 1/8 of an inch. Then I can go and press this with the right sides together, and I'm going to be careful when I'm pressing it that I don't remove any of the marks that I put in previously with my friction pen, because the friction pen does disappear with heat. So I'm going to trim the rest of this seam allowance off, press it with the right sides together, and then I can finish the French seam. I have sewn the final part of my French seam at 3/8 of an inch, and then I have just pressed the seam towards the right or left, right as you wear it, left as you look at it. And I was careful not to get rid of my marks for my, at least I think I was. She says. I think I might have got rid of that one. I'm going to have to put that one back in. But yes, I'm now going to gather along the bottom edge of the back bodice and the shoulder edge and the bottom front of the front bodice. My personal preference for running gathering stitches is to run a line of stitching 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge, and then to run another line of stitching 3/8 of an inch away from that original line of stitching. Now this line of stitching here is then in the actual garment allowance. The stitching line is in between these two lines of stitching. You want to double check that your fabric recovers well when it has stitches removed, because you will need to remove this line of stitching because otherwise it would be visible on the bodice, and you want to do that on a scrap piece of fabric before you start sewing on your garment. I have got my stitch length up to 5 for both of these, so I'm going to do exactly the same thing for my front bodice. Okay, so I have the shoulder seams pinned into place, I have the side seams pinned into place, all wrong sides together because I am going to French seam all of these. So with the shoulder seams you want to pin to the small dot, which you will have on the front, which is where your gathering starts, and on the back there is a small dot which shows you where your gathering piece should be put in between. So I've pinned there, and then I have pulled the gathers and pinned those into place. So I'm going to sew all of these seams at 1/4 of an inch to start my French seams. I have sewn the side seams and the shoulder seams at 1/4 of an inch, so I'm going to go around and trim the seam allowance in half, so I down to 1/8 of an inch, so I can press it and finish my French seams. I have finished off my French seams by sewing them at 3/8 of an inch, and I have removed the basting stitches from the gathering area. So I'm going to press the shoulder seams towards the back, and I'm going to press the side seams towards the back, and then we can install the twill tape and the facing. Before I put my pattern pieces away, I've actually drawn in the seam allowance on the front and bottom edge and the shoulder seam of my front bodice, and I've also drawn in the seam allowance of the shoulder, or the shoulder seam and the neck edge on the back of the facing. You could also do this with the back bodice pattern piece, but this is just a smaller one. So I want to add twill tape to stabilize my neckline. This is something that I've got from the Sew Over at Eve dress. It works really well. That neckline doesn't gape on me, and I want to implement that onto this dress. So I have measured from seam allowance to seam allowance along this front edge here, which is 15 inches, and then I have measured from seam allowance to fold line along this edge here, which is 4 3/4. So I need to times that by 2 and times that by 2, and then I'm going to add on a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance down the bottom here for both sides. So I could have just ignored this bit here, but my brain doesn't work that way. So I'm going to cut a piece of twill tape that is going to be that entire length, so that's 39 inches plus 1.25 inches, so it's 40 inches and 1/4. I think I've got that right. I'm going to cut myself a piece of twill tape, and I'm going to sew it in to the seam allowance of my front neck edge all the way around, and hopefully that will help to stabilize the front neck edge so that I don't get any gaping. I was close. I need it to be 40 3/4 inches. The other thing that I'm going to do is that I'm going to mark the increments onto the twill tape as I measure it out, and I'll show you what that looks like. I have marked onto my twill tape, so this is my shoulder seam, this is my centre back seam, my next shoulder seam, and I've also marked onto these edges the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So this will just help me get this all positioned into place, and if anything has stretched then it will help me to ease things into where they should be. So we've just finished the step 5, so we have our bodice front and back sewn together at the sides and shoulder seams, and we've already prepared our facing. So the next thing is to pin the facing to neck edge, stitch, trim and understitch facing. Before we do that, I want to add my twill tape in, and I have pinned it matching up my match points on my shoulder seam, centre back, and then the seam allowance at the front here. As you can see, I think you can just about see, I have offset it just a little bit, and I want to sew this in at 1/2 inch, and I have had to ease the front sections in. They have stretched out a little bit. There was no call for stay stitching on this, which does surprise me a little bit, but this should help us to stabilise the neck edge and make sure that it doesn't gape or stretch out over time. So I'm going to go around and sew the twill tape on at 1/2 inch the entire way round. I have sewn my twill tape on. The next thing is I'm going to attach my facing. So I'm going to attach the facing right sides together all the way around and stitch at 5/8 of an inch. I have sewn my facing in, I have trimmed my facing down with my pinking shears, and now I need to understitch the facing to the seam allowance to help it stay and roll to the inside, so I'm going to do that next. You can see here that I've understitched my lining to the seam allowance, and that's helped to roll everything to the inside. I've pressed it so the facing side is up and I can see the outer fabric rolling over, and I have pressed it all the way around. We're going to want to hand tack our seam allowance, or our facing to our seam allowance of our shoulder seams, if you've done a centre back seam like I have there as well, and the other shoulder seam. So the last thing that it would like us to do for this step is to turn facing inside, press, tack at seams, baste across lower edge. So we just need to baste across the lower edge and then tack it into place at the shoulder seams, and if you have a centre back seam like me, there as well. We can set our bodice aside for now, just a giant pile of fabric there, and we're going to work on our midriff panels. I'm going to need to interface a set of my midriff panels, and then I'm going to sew mine slightly differently because I want to leave an opening for the tie to pass through. So I'm going to mark that on my panels and show you how I sew it. I've pinned the midriff panels together, right sides together, matching up the notches, and on the right hand side, as you look at it with the wrong side facing you, I've made 2 marks. They're 1 inch in, and I'm going to stitch up to that point, back stitch, and then leave this place here open, and I'm going to do the same for the midriff lining as well. And then when we sew those together, I can then top stitch around this opening, which will allow me to pass the tie through and actually close my dress as a proper wrap dress. So I'm going to do that for both of the outer and the lining fabric on the right hand side, and then this one I'm going to sew at 5/8 of an inch the whole way up and down. So I have already made my ties, and I am going to be sewing my dress differently to this one, so we need to ignore this section here, and we've sewn the midriff the correct way if you're following along with me. So I have got my ties now because I have sewn the midriff pieces together and I've pressed the seam allowances open. So I've got my ties, and I have the seamed edge of the tie at the bottom of the midriff panel and the folded edge of the tie at the top, and I have attached it to both front edges, and I'm going to baste this into place at 3/8 of an inch. When I was pressing my ties, I have pressed the lining midriff side seams open, and I've also pressed up the seam allowance at the bottom by 5/8 of an inch so that we can hand stitch this into place later. I have pinned my midriff to my bodice with the right sides together, matched up all the notches in the side seams, and then I've pulled my gathering stitches to match up with the markings on the midriff section. So I'm going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch. The next thing we want to do is pin right side of midriff facing to wrong side of bodice, matching centres and seams, baste, stitch ends and upper edge trim. I have got my outer midriff on the interfaced one, and then on the other side I have sandwiched my inner midriff, and this one is the one which has got no interfacing on it. Made sure that the ones with the holes in them have lined up, and I have pinned it all the way around this edge, and I've made sure that the folded edge here is pinned back, and I'm going to sew all the way around, and I've pinned it so that I can see that previous line of stitching that I've done, because I'm going to sew on that previous line of stitching all the way around. Okay, so I've sewn all the way around the edge, and before I trim anything I want to turn my lining or midriff around the right way and make sure that I am happy with everything. I'm just gonna unpick this corner and redo it because my tie is just being caught in there, so I'm going to unpick that, and that's why we turn it through and just double check before we trim anything. So yeah, I'm just going to unpick this and make sure this line is lying a little bit flatter, but after I've done that I'm going to turn everything through and press everything down so that all the seam allowances and everything is into the midriff panel. Next we are going to work on the sleeves, so it would like us to ease stitch the upper edge of sleeve between the small circles, so I'm going to run some gathering stitches in between there, then we can sew our sleeve together, and I'm going to do that with a French seam. I've run my gathering or ease stitching around the cap of the sleeve from small dot to small dot, and I've done it in the same manner, so 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge and 3/8 of an inch away from that. So I'm now going to sew the side seams with a French seam, so I'm going to pin them wrong sides together. I have sewn the sleeve together at 1/4 of an inch, and I'm now just trimming that down to half of its seam allowance, so taking off 1/8 of an inch. Then I can press these with the right sides together and finish the French seam. So I'm going to do that for both sleeves. I have finished my French seams off by sewing at 3/8 of an inch, and I am now going to press these seams towards the front because we pressed the bodice side seams towards the back. If we press these towards the front, we can nest our seams when we come to sew our sleeves in. Now that we have sewn our side seams together and pressed them towards the front, I am going to make a narrow hem at the lower edge to insert my elastic into. So I'm actually going to sew mine at 3/8 of an inch all the way around to give me a pressing guide so that I can then turn it up and insert my 1/4 inch elastic. Okay, so I sewed a line of stitching 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge, and then I use that as my pressing guide, and then I've pressed it up again. So I am now going to use my blind hem foot to top stitch the edges down, and I'm going to leave myself a little 1-inch hole so that I can insert my elastic. I've cut myself some elastic, and I have made sure that it's comfortable to be worn around my forearm rather than just my wrist, because I can imagine that I will end up wearing these sleeves pulled up more often than I won't. They are looking like they might be a little bit short for me if I was just to wear them around my wrist. So I have cut 2 lengths of elastic, and I'm going to use a safety pin to pass them through the channel to then sew them in place, and then we can close up the channel and then attach our sleeves. Once you've fed your elastic through, you want to join the ends up and then close the opening that you left. So my sleeves are now done, and I'm going to attach them to my bodice with French seams. I have sewn my sleeve in at 1/4 of an inch, so I'm going to trim that down, and that's with the wrong sides together. I'm going to trim that seam allowance down, press it, and then sew the final part of the French seam at 3/8 of an inch. I have finished my armholes with a 3/8 of an inch seam, and that means that all the raw edges are enclosed and my arms or my sleeves are in. So the next thing that we want to do is open out the midriff facing, pin skirt to midriff, matching centres, clipping skirt where necessary, baste, stitch, trim, press seam towards midriff. So we are going to pin it all in place, make sure that the lining, midriff lining, is out of the way, and pin it all in place all the way around, matching up our notches, our side seams, our back seam, and then we can sew it into place. I have pinned my midriff section to my skirt with the right sides together. I'm going to sew it at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm actually going to sew it from the skirt side up because the skirt side is the one with more volume, and so there's more chance of getting tucks and puckers in this. So I want to make sure that it is getting sewn in nice and smoothly. Skirt is sewn to the midriff panel, and now we need to press the seam up so that we can wrap over our midriff lining and slip stitch that into place. But the last thing that I need to do with my sewing machine is to actually top stitch down the window that I have left for the tie to pass through. So I am going to pin this together, and I'm going to stitch around here 1/8 of an inch away from the opening just to secure those into place. I have top stitched all the way around my little window for my ties, so that is done. So the last thing I need to do is pin my midriff lining to my skirt and slip stitch that into place. I also need to tack down the facings because I haven't done that as yet, and I'm going to take that all up to mine to do that at my house. I have pinned my midriff lining to the skirt seam, and I am going to slip stitch that in place the whole way across. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comment section down below, and I will do my best to answer them for you. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I will see you again very soon. Bye!